Hello, happy Friday. I'm coming to you live from my panic room on this beautiful Friday. Today, I want to offer some commentary on the documentary that I assigned, the video about In Sickness and in Wealth, the effect of inequality on our health. And I want to apply some of the lessons about health infrastructure, health policy, and community stressors and resources to the place where we all call home, at least for some portion of the year, and that is Albion, Michigan. Okay, so I assigned this video to you. I rather like this film. It's probably not my personal favorite that I assign throughout the semester, but it's definitely up there. It's in the top three, I guess, and maybe that is an answer that might a question that might have a different answer depending on what I happen to be interested in more closely in a given semester. But nevertheless, I don't think it's very difficult for people to accept the theory that money and wealth influences people's health. It influences people's ability to live a healthy lifestyle. It influences people's ability to access preventative care, and it influences people's ability to manage and to treat the illnesses and diseases that they are ultimately exposed to. What I rather like about this film is it shows us two things. One, it shows us that in a high inequality society, even the wealthy, even those that are the winners of that society, end up worse off than they otherwise would. Inequality is something that affects all of us. Inequality is something that influences everybody, even if you are fortunate enough to be on top of that society, because of what it implies about stress. Furthermore, the second thing I really like about this film is it really gets into the nitty-gritty of the gradients of what the gradients of how narrow some of the margins are in what is known as the health wealth gradient. So if I think about the people in this film, you had the CEO of that hospital in Louisville, Kentucky. That guy is in a pretty high tax bracket. And then you had somebody who was working as a lab technician, right? And then you had somebody, so that would be like, I guess, lower middle class. And then you had somebody who was working as a janitor at that hospital who would clearly be working class and maybe even approaching poor, depending on what happens in a given year. And then you had the woman who was in what we would think of as the underclass and who clearly was not, well integrated into social structure and into the labor force. So it's easy to look at that and say, all right, this guy with the high paying job is going to be doing better than the person with the janitor, or Mary, the woman who does not regularly work. That's kind of easy. But if you think about that in context of what the Whitehall Study implies, the Whitehall Study was this landmark longitudinal research project on British civil servants. Even very minor differences in education and earning power, even those minor differences can produce measurably different outcomes in people's ability to live a healthy life, okay? And so what is wealth doing for us? Because when you die and you receive an autopsy, you don't get, your cause of death does not get identified as poverty or low education. It gets identified as stroke or heart attack or something like that. And what that speaks to, like all these things that kill people disproportionately or indisproportionately, depending on what tax bracket you happen to fall into, speaks to what I think is the biggest takeaway from this film, which is the role of stress in somebody's life. Stress kills us. Stress kills men in particular because we're not very good at dealing with the effects of it. So the Whitehall Study shows you these narrow notches in the health wealth gradient and how even just a little bit extra money or a little bit less money can set your life on a dramatically different course. The thing that unites everybody, if we're not all united by money, the thing that unites all of us is our exposure to stress. But the capacity we have to manage that stress, the capacity we have to deal with that stress, that's not equivalent or equal in the slightest. Okay. So I look at these four people featured in the film and I examine them according to what one of the experts quoted in the film said. And that's Dr. David Williams, who was an epidemiologist, I believe at Harvard. He says, or Cornell, one of those Ivy Leagues. Dr. Williams says stress, it talks about the role of stress. Let's just talk about the role of stress and that everybody is prone to stress. So if I look at the wealthiest man in this film, Jim, the hospital CEO, lived in that very nice neighborhood with a much higher life expectancy. He struck me as somebody who could be prone to stress, right? Like he had a high stress job. He had a very demanding job and one in which a lot of people were answering to him. So he has got some stress in his life. And then I think about the lab technician who's talking about debt and various other things. Seems like she had some stress in her life too. And I look at the janitor, in terms of just being one notch away from poverty. He seemed like he had a decent amount of stress in his life as well. And then Mary, the woman who was not working and was trying to make sure they had food for the end of the month, she definitely appeared stressed to me. So everybody's got stress. But the difference between various people's stressors are whether it's chronic or not. So if the Whitehall study told us about the health wealth gradient with British civil servants, the study of the macaque monkeys, oh man, that was interesting. I thought, at least. So what that tells us is the effect of chronic stress versus short-term stress. If I think about chronic stress, oh my goodness, those monkeys that were in subordinate social roles, because these monkeys, they have something approximating proto-society for sure. The subordinate monkeys and the dominant monkeys, I hope you could see that there was a very clear parallel and a comparison there to the society that surrounds us. Society can sometimes be divided into dominant and subordinate members, right? People who have higher levels of control and lower levels of control. So Jim, despite the fact that he has a stressful job, he could manage his stress better. It didn't become chronic. He could get his work done. He could kind of take out his stress on those below him, which I wouldn't really see that happen, but he could. He could give orders to others to get them to do things that take stress off of him. The janitor doesn't get to do that. The janitor has absolutely no control over how his day is going and no control over whether he's even going to have that job at a later point in the very near future, actually. So short-term stress is good. Short-term stress motivates us. It motivates us to study for our finals. It motivates us to get out of upsetting situations. The problem is chronic stress. I'm not sure if I gave this example in this class or it might have been in another class. I don't remember. But nevertheless, here's the way I like to think of it. Like if I went camping in the Upper Peninsula and I saw a grizzly bear, I'm not actually sure if grizzly bears live in the Upper Peninsula, but there are bears, I'm sure. Coming face to face with a bear seems to me like a pretty stressful situation. And the elevated stressed response of my body will allow me to run faster than I would normally be capable of running. It will give me that boost of adrenaline that allows me, like floods my body with quick response hormones that helps me get out of that stressful situation. If stress didn't serve a type of evolutionary advantage to us, we wouldn't have developed that capacity within our bodies. So at some point, this is the survival mechanism. Here's the problem. What if that bear is in front of you every single day? Now it's not so helpful anymore. People raised in chronically stressful situations where the stress is the same day after day after day, what happens to those people, social determinant of health research demonstrates, is that the on-off switch of their body's stress receptors, or whatever you want to call them, it gets flipped to permanently on. So if you can think about like a child raised in a house where dad is coming home from the bar every single night, right? This is not the situation that I was raised in, but unfortunately others are raised in that situation. And that flips that child's stress receptors to permanently on. And that floods your body with cortisol, which leads to a hardening of the arteries, which leads to heart disease in an earlier age than you otherwise would have it, which can lead to heart attacks in your 50s. So this is a good example of the social determinants of health. Somebody who's living under chronic stress, and poverty strikes me as a situation of chronic stress. Those people are having their health damaged day after day after day, and you can't even see it until it's already too late. Okay. So the question is not how do we treat heart disease? I mean, that is a question, but the questions that sociologists care the most about were how do you create a society that is less stressful, where it's maybe a little bit easier to be poor? I mean, granted, you probably in a capitalist market can't create a situation where it's easy to be poor. But we can create a situation where this chronic stress is reduced. There is no doubt in my mind that these social determinants of bad health can be reorganized in a way that they become social determinants of good health. So what I would be doing in class today if we were meeting is I would want us to think a little bit about Albion. Think about like if you were living your entire life in Albion, Michigan, what does the community setting mean for people's health? So if we look at these various kind of institutional factors, I want you to think about whether each one of these is a resource or a stressor. And you can actually have a situation where it's both in somewhat contradictory ways. Food access and food availability. Well, Albion does not have a grocery store. I mean, it's got family fare, but that doesn't really count. It doesn't have a big box grocery store. If you want to go to Meijer or Kroger, you have to go to Jackson for that. And that would mean you need to have a car. And that would mean you have to drive a 40-mile round trip. So I would call that a stressor for people living in Albion. Even Marshall, which is much wealthier, does not actually have a big box grocery store. Quality education. Well, this one might be... This one's probably a little contradictory. You got this lovely little liberal arts college there, but that's assuming you can even get to college in the first place. And I know we have the Build Albion Fellows program, but that's that's a small program for as nice as it ultimately is. Albion does not have a high school, so that means students have to go to Marshall, which, if you talk to people on various sides of the divide here, it's very interesting. If you talk to people from Marshall, their attitude is, well, we saved the Albion school system. And if you talk to people from Albion, the attitude is, well, they ruined our school system. It really depends on what side of the tracks you're on. So education, if you can attend the college, it's nice to have that within the community, and it does create what's known as an anchor institution. That's an institution that isn't moving or getting outsourced the way that the factories in Albion used to. But that's assuming you can even get there in the first place. If I think about transportation and planning, well, we got this Amtrak line that runs right through Albion, so that's great if you want to go to Chicago or Detroit on the train. But if I'm trying to get to work on public transportation, that immediately becomes far more difficult than it otherwise would be if you had some type of public transportation. But the city is just too small to really have that. If I think about affordable housing, this is a highly variable thing. Like if I have a decent amount of wealth, I'm able to buy houses very affordably. And, they have all these programs to encourage faculty to buy homes within the Albion area. But there is a decent amount of vacancy in the area, and that hurts everybody. That means even if you are buying a house and you're not affiliated with the college in any way, your property values are going to be distressed, even if you live in a pretty nice place. And the reason why is because supply and demand, guys. It's not really more complicated than that. There's a lot more empty lots than you would want to have normally to keep the property values at the peak of where they could otherwise be. Good jobs and work opportunities. I know that there's a couple factories still within the vicinity of Albion, but it's not what it used to be. And that's why from 1970 onward, the city of Albion has lost over 30% of her population over that time frame. And you know what, look, if you, like, Detroit has had tremendous population loss as well, but you still have 700,000 people that call that place home, 684K to be exact. In the case of Albion, even just losing a few thousand people is catastrophic to things like the school systems and to things like the local economic consumer base. So going from 12,500 to 8,500 is, I mean, that's a very, very big deal in Albion. And that leads very much to the next point of business investment and development. With such a small population and such a high poverty rate in Albion is over 30%. People are not opening high wage businesses. And that's why when something like the Foundry Deli opens or the Malleable Brewery opens, it's a really big deal. I hope you guys have seen this in Albion. It's a big freaking deal when something opens. And it should be, because business investment is not attracted to a community like that. And so that limit in terms of people's health, you can see how that would lead in effect. It cuts down on the number of jobs that might be available, places to spend the money in a healthy way. And so good jobs and work opportunities, that affects the business investment, and that affects the income and wealth, which is low. And we know what effect that has on people's health as well. In terms of social supports, there's some programs that are run by the college. There are definitely some local programs. Like I think there's a veterans thing in town. There's an NAACP chapter, and that stuff definitely helps. So I don't actually really know what to say about social support. I could see that being a resource. I could see that being a stressor in some ways as well, because I do know that in terms of welfare, like that's not, that can be difficult to get in Albion. Public safety, well, crime rates here are actually lower than they are in other urban areas, so maybe that looks okay. Green spaces and recreational opportunities, I actually don't really know what to put to that. I actually think there's a lot of green space in Albion, and there's a lot of parks in Albion that maybe this town would not be as nice in the absence of those parks. So, like, if I add all this up, there are some I'm not quite sure about, but there are others where I can say, no, that's very clearly a stressor. So I would ask you to make a prediction now. Do you think that life expectancy in Albion, Michigan is higher or lower than it is nationwide? You can kind of figure this out by just tallying up what we identified as a stressor and what we identified as a resource or an asset. It's lower. Nationally, the life expectancy in the United States of America is 78 years old. In Albion, it's about 75. And it's lower. It's about 73 and a half for men in Albion. So looking forward throughout the rest of our lives, I encourage you to turn a more critical eye to the world that surrounds you. Whenever we go to the doctor, we're always told about, like, are you exercising? You're not smoking, right? Like, you're doing, your personal behavior is what they want to know about whether or not you're doing things in a healthy way. I encourage you to turn a more critical eye to the society that surrounds you and try to understand whether that is encouraging or discouraging healthy behavior, whether that is encouraging or discouraging your personal choice, and most importantly, whether that is increasing or alleviating your likelihood of experiencing chronic stress. We are living through a very stressful society right now at the moment, but I can tell you, for me, it's not nearly as bad as it is for probably many other people. And one of the big reasons for that is, even though I would want to be teaching in person, I want to be coming into work every day, I don't want people to be dying of this virus and its related complications. I can tell you the thing that stops me from experiencing any type of chronic stress right now, I know where my paycheck is coming from, and I know I'm not missing one. Like I'm very solid about what my contract looks like, and I know I can rely on that paycheck at the end of the month, every month. And so think about how social conditions influence your health behaviors and your stress levels, because right now is the time to organize your life in such a way that allows you to live the fullest, happiest, healthiest life that you are personally capable of living. Thanks very much. Be back next week with some final wrap-up thoughts about society and the world and the future and technology and all that cool stuff, but we're getting to the end of it now. Assignment 3, as I have said in my email, that is posted to the course page. So I encourage you to get started on that, and early submissions are always fine. Take care of yourselves. Stay healthy. Have a nice weekend.